Thanks for joining me for the third and final instalment of my storytelling. Pull up a chair, turn off your mobile phones, and I'd like to read you a story called The Orthodox Heretic. There was once a small town filled with believers who always sought to act in obedience to the teachings of God. When faced with difficult situations, the leaders of the community would often be found deep in prayer or searching the scriptures for guidance and wisdom. Late one evening, in the middle of winter, a young man from the neighbouring city arrived at the gates of the town's church seeking refuge. The caretaker, a man of deep faith, immediately let him in and, seeing that he was cold and hungry, provided a warm meal and some fresh clothes. After he had rested, the young man explained how he had fled the city because the authorities had labelled him a political dissident. It turned out that the man had been critical of both the government and the church in his work as a journalist. The caretaker brought the young man back to his home and allowed him to stay until a plan had been worked out concerning what to do next. When the priest was informed of what had happened, he called the leaders of the town together in order to work out what ought to be done. After 2 days of discussion, it was agreed that the man should be handed over to the authorities in order to face up to the crimes he had committed. But the caretaker protested, saying, "This man has committed no crimes. He has merely criticised what he believes to be the injustices perpetrated by the authorities in the name of God." "What you say may be true," replied the priest, "but his presence puts the whole of this town into danger. For what if the authorities find out where he is and learn that we have protected him?" But the caretaker refused to hand him over to the priest, saying, "He is my guest, and while he is under my roof, I will ensure that no harm comes to him. If you take him from me by force, then I will publicly attest to having helped him and suffer the same injustice as my guest." Well, the caretaker was well loved by the people, and the priest had no intention of letting something happen to him. So the leaders went away again, and this time searched the scriptures for an answer, for they knew that the caretaker was a man of deep faith. After a whole night of poring over the scriptures, the leaders came back to the caretaker saying, "We have read the sacred book all through the night, seeking guidance, and have found that it tells us that we must respect the authorities of this land and witness to the truth of faith through submission to them." But the caretaker also knew the sacred words of Scripture, and he told them that the Bible also asks that we care for those who suffer and are persecuted. So there and then, in desperation, the leaders began to pray fervently. They beseeched God to speak to them, not as a still small voice in their conscience, but rather in the way that he had spoken to Abraham and Moses. They begged God to communicate directly to them, so that the caretaker would see the error of his ways. Well, sure enough, the sky began to darken, and God descended from heaven, saying, "The priests and elders speak the truth, my friend. In order to protect this town, the man must be handed over to the authorities." But the caretaker, a man of deep faith, looked up to heaven and replied, "If you want me to remain faithful to you, my God, then I can do nothing but refuse your advice. For I do not need the scriptures or your words to tell me what I ought to do. You have already demanded that I look after this man. You have already written that I must protect him at all costs. Your words of love have been spelled out on the lines of this man's face. Your text is in the texture of his flesh. So, my God, I defy you precisely in order to remain faithful to you." With this, God turned to the town's leaders and addressed them directly. "If I cannot convince him, then neither will you. Now leave him in peace." Then God quietly withdrew with a smile, knowing that the matter had finally been settled.